the Americans have a fundamental ideological problem with China, and it's because of their own sort of supremacist way of thinking about themselves. They cannot accept that a country which is not a democracy, which has a different method of governing society, can be the equal of theirs.
Welcome everyone, it's Jeff from The Burning Archive, and I've got a very special guest with me today. It's Michael Pembroke, author of Silk Silver Opium, The Trade with China That Changed History. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
Michael, you are an author of, as well as Silk Silver Opium, author of several books. Can you just tell us a little bit about your story of how you came to be writing as a former judge?
Yes. Well, I left the law in order to write full time, Jeff. I'd been writing books and pursuing my daytime career as a judge for 10 years. And although I was doing both jobs adequately, I was looking forward to the pleasure of being able to write in my own time without the pressures of having to go to court. So that happened in February 2020, just before COVID. I didn't know COVID was going to happen, and everything changed in the legal profession. The judges had to keep going to work. They had to keep dressing up, putting on their wigs and gowns, but the barristers stayed at home and zoomed in from their bedrooms. So I missed all that.
Your book, Silk Silver Opium, is the story of Imperial China's trading relationship with the West and its implications for the future. A tale worth telling, and you tell it very well in this book. You write not as an academic historian, but as a retired judge. Can we start with what motivated you to write this book?
Well, the last two books had been the book on Korea, which was highly critical of the American conduct of the war and its conduct of the politics. So along came 2020 and COVID, and there was an unbelievable amount of prejudice against China in those days, which had flipped, really. I mean, only 10 years before, there'd been much more rational attitudes towards China. I don't suggest that China is perfect, and I'm not an apologist for it at all, but I'm a pragmatist, I hope, and a realist. And I thought the prejudice bordering on racism, the ideology, the evangelism in the case of our own Prime Minister at the time, the Christian supremacy, the democratic supremacy, all those sorts of things made me want to write a slightly lighter book about the history of China, so that, and I didn't want to deal with the 20th century or the 21st century. I wanted to deal with the past and explain how over the 2,000-year period of the imperial dynasties, China and the West related through trade. For most of that time, it was a happy story. It was not a happy story in the 19th century. That's why I adopted that particular style, which is not too far from the style I used in my book on Arthur Phillip, but it has been described as racy, and I hope it's readable. Well, I know it's readable. People keep telling me it's readable, so I wanted to appeal to not the political scientists and the boffins and the Canberra establishment but I wanted to appeal to ordinary people who didn't know enough about the history of China.
The first half of your book shows China's dominance in the world economy before 1820, and the three trade products or commodities of your title, silk, silver and opium. Is the main idea of the book that the last 200 or less years have been the exception in 2,000 years of Chinese primacy in the world economy?
Yes. I'm not the only one to say this. Many other commentators make the same point. And the point is that the last 200 years, since about 1820, represent an aberration in relations between China and the West. Before 1820, there were a series of powerful dynasties that represented strong ties with the West through trade. The very first dynasty was the Qin, and what the Qin did was establish a feature of Chinese politics which is central today. That is strong, centralized political control and a bureaucracy based on merit. That was a major change in the way most governments, or nearly all governments in the world, operated. The Qin was followed by the Han, and the silk trade routes during the Han reached the eastern periphery of the Roman Empire, and silk made its way into Rome, which caused a sensation because the Romans and all Europeans knew only linen and wool and furs, and nothing like the quality of silk was ever seen before. There was then a period of unrest, but it was followed by the Tang dynasty, and during the 8th century, it could truly be said, and many historians have testified to this, that Chang'an, which is now Xi'an, 1,000 kilometers southwest of Beijing, was the center of the world in terms of culture and commerce. It was the eastern terminus of the Silk Roads. It was, in those days, something like 3 times larger than Rome, 4 times larger than Alexandria, and 17 times larger than Byzantium. And it was a polyglot metropolis full of cultures from everywhere. The Tang was followed by the Sung dynasty, and that was a high period of culture and scientific invention. In fact, most people know the wonderful book by Simon Winchester, who wrote about the inventions of the Chinese. Most of those inventions, many of them, were created during the Sung dynasty. The Sung dynasty was followed by the Mongols. Now, the Mongols were foreigners, of course, but they made trade between China and the West free and open in a way that was superior to past periods. There had been a period when the Silk Roads were sort of blocked by wars and so forth in Central Asia, but the Mongols reopened the way, and in fact there were visits from Rome, from Avignon, from Paris, from bishops and representatives of the church, all the way to the Mongol capital, and the Mongols sent their own emissaries back to the Pope, and it was a period of when there was not much cultural prejudice. Kublai Khan, in particular, accepted all religions without sort of modern discrimination. His mother was a Nestorian Christian, I think. They were tough in battle, but they were also good at commerce. But the Mongols were actually fairly short-lived in China, as you know. They were there for less than 100 years. Their dynasty was called the Yuan dynasty. They were followed by the Ming in 1368, and for the first 60 years of the Ming, there was a great efflorescence of trade and overseas exploration through the treasure fleets of the Ming dynasty between 1405 and 1433. And then, for reasons which historians know well and which I've mentioned, the imperial court shut down the treasure fleet voyages. So there was then a period, at least at the government level, when China closed itself off to the world. Private traders continued, and the shipping trade had begun in a big way under the Sung dynasty, continued under the Mongols, and continued again through private trade under the Ming, out of Fujian province. and in particular Shangzhou, which I went to last November, was the great maritime port which Marco Polo visited, and expressed amazement at the number of foreign ships in the port of Shangzhou. Then, from the 1500s onwards, the Europeans started to arrive. And first the Portuguese, of course, then the Dutch, the Spanish through the Philippines, then the English and Swedes and French, and eventually the Americans. And they traded peacefully and profitably and in a big way through the 1600s and 1700s in particular. The 1700s were, in Europe at least, and to some extent in the United States, because George Washington was a great fan, a period where there was almost a mania for everything Chinese. The chinoiserie style was extremely popular in fashion, in garden design, in furniture. Chippendale copied the chinoiserie style, so it was the absolute height of the European infatuation with China. In fact, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, said in 1750, in mid-century, he said, if China was as close to us as France, everything we buy, everything we own would be Chinese.
You've talked a little bit about the Silk Roads already. The book highlights, as well as China's trading relationships with the West, its trading relationships with other parts of the world, including through the Silk Roads with Central Asia, the Sogdians, and the Byzantium or East Roman Empire. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Silk Roads?
Well, I mentioned that the eastern terminus of the Silk Roads was Chang'an or Xi'an. That they were trade routes, and those routes starting in Chang'an travelled west towards the desert in the western regions of China. One route went around the north, one route went around the south. They tended to meet again at Kashgar in modern Xinjiang. And from there, they would climb the Pamirs, the mountains on the western side. The Hindu Kush was a bit further to the south, but it was an extremely mountainous region. The trade routes were populated by camel trains. These were the Bactrian camels of Central Asia with two humps, and not the spindly-legged Arabian camels. They managed well in the mountains and in the steep passes, and they would then go down over the Pamirs into a very fertile, verdant land, which the Romans called Sogdiana. The Greeks had another name for it as well. And it was that now not so verdant land between the Oxus and the Jaxartes rivers, as they were called then, in modern Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, I think. Now, from that point, you could take the route south through the Indus Valley, over the Hindu Kush, through the Indus Valley to the seaports at the mouth of the Indus Valley, near Karachi. Or you could keep travelling west over the Iranian plateau. The route then would take you all the way to the Euphrates River. There was another route which went over to the north of the Caspian Sea, and I think over to the north of the Black Sea also, and it would traverse sort of Ukraine and Inner Mongolia that way. So there were a number of different routes, and it wasn't as if one merchant would take his camel train from beginning to end. There were many different sections of the route where merchants would take the camels and their goods as far as they could, then hand over. The goods would be exchanged. The price would keep going up and up and up every time the goods were exchanged, so that by the time it got to Rome, the silk, for example, was many, many times the price which the Chinese had paid at its origin. And that's how the Silk Roads worked. And Jeff, I shouldn't forget Constantinople. The route went to Constantinople, of course. The Byzantines, especially the clergy and the elites, loved silk. They loved their silk robes. In the 5th century, in the time of the first Eastern Roman emperor, it's not proven, but often recited. It's said that monks who were representatives of the emperor in Constantinople smuggled silkworms back to Constantinople and learnt the secret and started the industry.
The silver in your title connects China's trade not just with the West, but to the silver mines of South America and with the Philippines via the Spanish galleons that carried all that silver, the Manila galleon. How does silver transform the world economy through from the 1500s, and also how does it change things within China?
Well, let me start with a couple of observations by contemporary philosophers. The French philosopher Montesquieu said that the China trade based on silver was the greatest commerce of the universe. And Adam Smith, around the same time, these were 18th century commentators, said that silver was the means by which the distant countries of the world are connected. Silver had such a major effect in the 18th century that earlier in that century, Sir Isaac Newton, who was warden of the Royal Mint, among other roles, expressed despair that he said, the trade from China is so huge that it takes away all the silver of Europe. And finally, I like to mention Carl Linnaeus, better known as a botanist, but he was also a man of letters. He sounded like a modern Trumpian because he said, there is nothing more important than to close that gate to China through which all the silver of Europe goes. China wanted silver for its products. It didn't need or want much else that Europe had to offer. Silver had become the sort of major currency of China. They had experimented with the paper currency in past periods, especially during the Sung dynasty. The Mongols had a paper currency as well, but an early Ming emperor stopped the production of paper notes. The demand for silver in China was so great that silver was worth, for most of the time, double what it was worth in Europe. So merchants and traders and bankers did what they always do. They sought to profit from the arbitrage. So everyone wanted to bring their silver to China where it was worth twice as much as they could get in Europe. The mines that the Spanish had established in the viceroyalties of Peru and later Mexico churned out silver at a rate that was then unknown. The mine at Potosi in modern Bolivia, which was then in the viceroyalty of Peru, was regarded as the greatest, richest deposit of silver ever known. So the silver from those mines would initially go up to modern Panama, across the isthmus, and then at Portobello, one of the treasure ports on the Spanish Main, would go by ship back to Cadiz, and then it was relayed through Europe to the counting houses in Amsterdam and London, and then would eventually go to China. After the Spanish established a settlement in the Philippines in 1571, they then had a depot, a base from which they could trade with the Chinese who came across from Fujian province. And most importantly, they also discovered the way back, because that took a long time to work out because of the currents and the winds. So there then, from about the late 1570s, for the next 250 years, was the phenomenon of the Manila galleon trade. Spanish ships built in the Philippines with hardwood would travel between Manila and Acapulco in Mexico, they would leave Acapulco with chests of silver. They were floating bank vaults and ripe for pirates and privateers and British naval officers. But most of them got through. The silver was then used to buy exotica from China and the Far East in Manila, and the ships would return, usually overladen, heavily overladen, but they were giant ships. They were the super containers of that age. And then they would return after a long journey back to Acapulco. At Acapulco, there was an annual trade fair because the ships only arrived once a year. And the Acapulco trade fair was the greatest trade fair in the world at that time. And the goods that were not sold at the trade fair, which was most of them really, then went up to Mexico City along a road called colloquially known as the Camino del Chin. And from Mexico City, they would then be sent down to Portobello again and then shipped to Europe. Mexico City became rich from the China trade, and it was regarded by some as the center of the universe between China in the West and Europe in the East. Silver effectively became the means by which the global trade first became established. Until the Manila galleon route to the Philippines was opened, or when it was opened, trade could go around the world, all the way around the world. And it connected the 4 known continents at that time. In fact, Spain became so rich from the silver mined in its mines in South America and Mexico, generated by the demand for that silver from China, that it was able to afford 100 years of war against the Northern European Protestant countries and against the Ottomans at the same time. Eventually, Spain, through bad management, the Spanish king, one of the Philips II maybe, was regarded by European bankers as the borrower from hell. So often did he default. So they were rich, but they were greedy and they borrowed too much.
As well as silk, silver and opium, 3 products that are central to your story of China's trading relationship with the West. Chinoiserie, so I guess Chinese design-inspired furniture and interior design, porcelain and tea. It's the soft power. These products, to some degree, represent some of the soft power of China into the 19th century. And they're central to your story as well, and shine a different light on the cultural relationship between the West and China. If you visit the royal palaces of Europe or Russia, you'll see astonishing collections of these products from the 18th century. They were, I guess, the wonder products, the fashionable wonder products, but also everyday products in 19th or 18th century Europe. Can you tell us about how they fit into the story?
Well, the 3 great products of China, there were more, but the 3 main ones were silk, tea, and porcelain. The silver was what the Europeans paid in exchange, and from the 19th century onwards, they substituted opium. By the 18th century, the English East India Company, in the early 1700s, realised that there was a big market for tea. Tea was unknown in England in Shakespeare's time, say 1600. The East India Company was slow to pick up on the potential demand for tea, but when they did, they brought in tea in such increasing quantities that it was, as I said, an example of the economic law which economists debate about, that supply creates its own demand. The more tea that was brought into England, the more people wanted it. And while it started as a product of fashion and elitism, from the 1700s onwards, tea started to become democratized and popular throughout England. And the profits from tea for the East India Company and indirectly for the British government was so great in terms of profits to the company itself and duties on the tea imports that it sustained the City of London. It was essential for the prosperity of the City of London and the happiness of the people of England. So the tea trade became the most important trade for the East India Company and the most important trade along with the sugar which the English added to the tea, which came from the cane fields of the West Indies, to British society at that time. In fact, there was a triangle: tea, slavery, and sugar were all supporting each other. They all propped each other up. Tea was the most important thing that the East India Company in China exported from China. Other products became less important, so that by the beginning of the 19th century, the early 1800s, the British could not allow anything to interfere with the tea trade. It was essential to the profitability of the City of London, as I mentioned. Now, the other product was porcelain. Well, porcelain fascinated the Europeans for hundreds of years because they couldn't work out how to make it. It had confounded them, and especially in the German states, there was a major attempt to get to the bottom of this strange commodity that was unlike anything else they'd ever seen. Europeans were used to earthenware, which had an entirely different quality and inferior quality, and of course wood and pewter, and the very wealthy had silver and gold. But porcelain was such a mysterious product that it captured the imagination not just of merchants, but of kings and queens and the elite of Europe. And of course, they went to all lengths to work out the secret of making porcelain. Eventually, the secret was discovered by a man called Johann Bottger, who was effectively a prisoner of King Augustus of Poland and Saxony. I think he was Elector of Saxony. And he was sort of kept in a dungeon working away for years on end under the supervision of a local scientist called Schierhaus. And 1708, he cracked the code. He worked out the secret of porcelain. The secret was the ingredients and the very high temperature. Porcelain had to be fired at almost 1400 degrees, which was hotter than anything otherwise known. But the ingredients were a white clay called pétunce and another product called a silica-based stone. Some was discovered near Meissen in Germany. It took a long time for the French to find similar ingredients near Sèvres in France, and a long time for the English to discover similar ingredients in Cornwall in the west of England. And of course, there was great secrecy around the production process, but the secret got out quite quickly. And after Meissen, factories were established in Venice and Vienna. But that was the early 1800s. The early 1700s. It was not until 1768 that the English fired their first porcelain, and that was a rather mundane beer tankard. And of course, that great industrialist of the 18th century in England, Wedgwood, got onto it very quickly, and he got hold of the process and the land and the products, and he then took it over. But the Wedgwood and the other English potteries did not create as much porcelain as Meissen and the European ones. The Central Europeans in particular, as you've seen from their palaces, were utterly preoccupied with porcelain, and they decorated whole rooms with them, and they made fireplaces of them, and whole walls.
This was also partly a reflection of China's, I guess, the prestige of its political system within Europe before the 19th century, quite contrary perhaps to some perceptions of Western dominance. Indeed, you quote Voltaire, the French Enlightenment thinker, in the lead up to the French Revolution, writing, "One need not be obsessed with the merits of the Chinese to recognise that their empire is in truth the best that the world has seen." Can you tell us more about how China's trade led not just to economic clout but to cultural influence?
I wanted to mention and explain that the intellectual admiration for China and Europe was largely based on its political system, which in a sense still contains the same elements. What they admired was that it was a secular government, that the bureaucracy was elected on merit, appointed on merit, and that there was strong central control. In fact, there was no meritocratic bureaucracy in Britain until 1870, and in the discussions and reports that ensued about how to improve the British civil service, John Meadows famously said that we must copy the Chinese system because they have a superior system of bureaucrats appointed on merits after a competitive examination. The British introduced for the first time competitive civil service examinations in 1870. And they admired, the intellectuals admired, that China was a secular state without the interference of a church. There were many aspects of the way China was governed that appealed to those elites.
Opium connects the story to South Asia and becomes central to the story of Western Euro-American penetration of China in the 19th century, which we'll get to in a moment. But can you first say a little bit about the opium trade?
Now, opium had been around for centuries. The Sumerians knew opium. That was common around the Mediterranean. Its sort of natural home was in modern Turkey, but it had never been industrialized, corporatized, and commercialized in the way that the East India Company did so in India in the late 18th and early 19th century, all the way through the 19th century. The East India Company decided that it had to get into the business of producing opium, knowing that there was hardly any of it went to India. The market was China. They knew there was a market in China. They knew that it was contraband in China. They knew the emperor had banned it, but that wasn't going to stop them. They created, along an 800-kilometre stretch of the lower Ganges River, a production area for opium, which involved huge fortress-like establishments where the opium production process took place based upon the poppies that were grown in fields along that 800-kilometre stretch. The main headquarters of the opium production were the cities of Patna and Benares. In fact, those names became household brand names for opium. You could look up newspaper reports whenever you travelled east of Suez to see the latest market prices for Patna opium or Benares opium. The reason for getting into the opium production business was to overcome the drain on silver from the British Treasury. The East India Company would sell the opium at auctions in Calcutta to private traders. The private traders would then smuggle the opium to China. The private traders would usually buy the opium on credit at the auctions. credited with the East India Company. They would then sell it to smugglers and drug dealers in the waters near Canton, and they would receive silver in return. And then they would take the silver to the East India Company treasury in Canton and would receive in exchange bills of exchange, which they could discount or trade back to London and in other places as well. So the effect of this process was to drain China of its silver and for the silver to come back indirectly through the East India Company back to London. In fact, the investment banks, the Bank of England, the London trading houses sustained, in a very real sense, the opium market through the bills of exchange. The bills which those establishments issued were traded and discounted around the world and used for other trade. Americans used them for buying cotton, or traders used them to buy cotton from the Americans, and they would come back and they would be used in countless ways around the world. So the interlocking web of financial institutions in London and the heft which the East India Company carried, because it was the largest corporation in the British economy, meant that despite the moral objections of many, there was great reluctance and great difficulty in stopping the opium trade to China. And of course, it was another example of supply creating its own demand, just like tobacco. The more opium was pumped into China, the more there was a demand for it, the more people bought it, and the greater the damage to the Chinese population. It took a long, long time before the opium trade was stopped at the beginning of the 20th century.
What is the story of the Opium Wars?
The importance of the opium trade, which became sort of more important than the tea trade, was the reason for the wars and conflict which began between Britain and China in 1839. The emperor at the time decided that he had to stop the opium trade. It was doing too much damage to his people. He commissioned one of his officials, Lin Zheju, to go to Canton to stop the trade. Lin Zheju, like many Chinese, was very sort of black and white. He told the Europeans to give up their opium and gave them a time limit. They couldn't believe that he was serious, and they didn't give up their opium. He then locked them in the 13 factories on the Canton waterfront and kept them there. It wasn't as bad as some people and some books have suggested, but it caused great alarm in England, and as a result, they sent out an invasion force. And the British effectively invaded China in late 1839 and conducted a war between 1839 and 1842, resulting in the Treaty of Nanjing. And the Treaty of Nanjing was the first of the great unequal treaties. And by that treaty, which China really had no bargaining strength in, the first 5 treaty ports were made available to European trade, and the island of Hong Kong, not Kowloon Peninsula, not the new territories, but the island of Hong Kong, was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. The war erupted again in 1858 when, effectively over access to Canton, the British found a pretext. It was a transparent pretext, and access to Canton had not been given as it should have been given according to the Treaty of Nanjing. So there was another war, another treaty of Tianjin. The Chinese refused to ratify the treaty 12 months later when they had promised to do so, and there was a second round of the war, which resulted in the famous 1860 desecration of the old summer palace in Beijing. I say desecration; it was a complete looting. All the treasures of the old summer palace were taken or destroyed, and the summer palace was burnt. Jeff, the French, who were allies with the British in the Second Opium War, refused to participate in the torching of the old summer palace. They called it a Goth-like act of barbarism. So it was just a British endeavour, and it's not forgotten by the Chinese. They've kept the old summer palace in its state of ruin as a memento of those days.
From this perception that China had the best the world has seen, it fell dramatically in the 19th century into the century of humiliation. And you write, in 1820, as the British opium trade was getting into its stride, China had the largest share of the world's gross domestic product. By the end of empire in 1912, the country was a social and economic shambles and would remain so until late in the 20th century.
I have to say the collapse of China, in all fairness, in the late 19th century was not all because of the British or the French. There was a massive internal revolt called the Taiping Rebellion, which occupied about 10 years, covered most of the Yangtze Valley area, and killed tens of millions of people. It was a result of the weakening of central control, the central imperial control, and a sign of the times. China's emperors in the 19th century, after the three great emperors, ending in Qianlong in 1799, were increasingly weak, increasingly able to hold control. And from 1860 onwards, 1860 to 1908, the effective power behind the throne was, of course, the Empress Dowager Cixi, who held back China's development and contributed to its decline.
Part of the story of the late 19th century in China is the failure of China to modernise or to reform. Modernise is not a great word. In ways that, for example, the Meiji, Imperial Japan under the Meiji in the late 19th century did. And this failure to modernise leads into the Boxer Rebellion and the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912 and of Imperial China in 1912, its reformation as a nation state. Can you tell us more about that part of the story?
Well, I haven't done a comparison of Meiji Japan and China, but Meiji Japan did have strong central control, and I think strong American influence. China suffered at that time from weak central control, and it had diverse interests among its population and amongst its governors and elites. It had an awful lot of sort of backward thinking among its elites, influenced by Confucian traditional thinking. There was a theory that trains and telegraph lines would upset the spirits of the dead and so forth. So it took a long time for China to come out of that thinking, and Empress Dowager Cixi actually led some of the opposition to railways and telegraph lines until right at the end when she reneged, when she knew that China had to change. But it didn't help at all that from the 1860s onwards, the European nations, and by this stage the Americans and their missionaries were just running all over China. They could go wherever they wanted to. They had extraterritoriality in every commercial city or town or port they established. They undermined the Chinese legal system. They established their own legal systems. Their banks came in by the dozen and issued their own currencies. They contributed to an enormous destabilization of the country. And on top of that, the missionaries added much more to the destabilization because of their undermining of traditional Confucian values and the imposition of Christianity, or their attempt to do so. So there was much unhappiness, much instability, financial instability, social dislocation and instability. By the 1890s, Russia, Germany, Britain and France could effectively take a slice of China for themselves without any further fighting. The emperor could not afford to fight them. So there's the famous cartoon of the Kaiser, the Tsar, Queen Victoria and the French Marianne carving up the cake of China. The Germans had a port at Qingdao on the Shandong Peninsula. The Russians had a port just north of the Bohai Sea. The British had a port at Weihai, then known as Port Edward, and the French had a port in South China called Fort Bayard then. Britain also acquired the new territories in 1898 on a 99-year lease. It had acquired the Kowloon Peninsula at the end of the Second Opium War, so that by 1898 Britain had an aggregation of 3 territories which in aggregate amounted to Hong Kong. 2 were given to them in perpetuity. The new territories was given under a 99-year lease. The 99-year lease expired in 1997, and at that time Britain decided, for some practical as well as political and moral reasons, to give up all 3. France, under de Gaulle, gave up their territory in southern China in 1945, and Germany and Russian territories went back, I think, to China at the time of the First World War. You know, it was a terrible time of indignity from the second half of the 19th century, and the Opium Wars really started it, but they didn't finish it. What finished it was the Boxer Uprising. The uprising, it wasn't a rebellion against the government; it was an uprising against the Europeans and their missionaries. And the Boxers were brutal, of course, and one can not condone their behaviour, but one can understand it. And when it was reported back to the European press that the Boxers had laid siege to the legation quarter in Beijing, which was a large area where the only Europeans and Christian Chinese could be, and I think the initial report said they massacred them all, which was not correct. Then that set off alarm bells, and an invasion force was sent, and it was another coalition of the willing, or maybe the first coalition of the willing, because it was 8 separate countries, including actually Australia sent a small contingent, but we were not one of the 8. We love to get along, and that was the final indignity. And they fought all the way up from the entrance to Tianjin, all the way to Beijing, and there was even more looting in Beijing in 1900 in response to the Boxer uprising than there was in Beijing in the Old Summer Palace in 1860, because the looting in 1900 was not carried out just by the soldiers; it was carried out by everyone. Diplomats would fill up carriages, or their wives would. Civilians were fully engaged in the looting as well as the military. So it was the beginning of the end for China, and it didn't take long, only the next 10 years before the empire collapsed, and China entered a very difficult period of the Republic from 1912 to 1949. But I stop at 1912, thankfully.
Although you've not written about post-1912 Chinese history, you have written a book during the first Trump administration about the Korean War, Korea where the American century began, in which you argue that war set the pattern for America's first modern war with China. What are your thoughts on how America is coming to terms with a world in which it no longer dominates like it did in the 1950s and for much of the American century?
The Americans have a fundamental ideological problem with China, and it's because of their own sort of supremacist way of thinking about themselves. They they cannot accept that a country which is not a democracy, which has a different method of governing society, can be the equal of theirs. Now, China is authoritarian. It has strong central political control. It has massively decentralized economic control, decentralized to the governors and mayors of the cities and towns of China. But it is a different system. But it is one of the 193 countries recognized by the United Nations and was the first country to sign the United Nations Charter. So you hear fantastically sort of naive comments from the Americans about China being socialist or communist or anti-Christian. There was a big sort of Christian influence, of course, in the American attitude. But the fact is that China it has retained, or the governing political party has retained the name the Communist Party of China. But 60% of China's economy is generated by private enterprises. Yes, there is a certain large amount of central control, but you can get rich in China for yourself. If you get too rich or become important, or you start criticising the government, that's a different matter, and perhaps the treatment of Jack Ma is a good example of that. But it's a different way. People value security and prosperity in China more than the Americans who value freedom.
We've seen a shift in attitudes in Australia towards China over the last 10 to 20 years, from trading partner to security threat. Could I ask for your reflections on how you see the best way to engage with China?
Well, Jeff, you see it in Northern Europe as well. It's not just Australia. In Australia, the defence and intelligence establishment, I think, has been captured by Washington. They echo Washington's views, and I don't think that is necessarily the view of all Australians. But it is widely represented across the mainstream press. It's possible that the West has taken a turn to the right. I mean, the West is less important than it used to be. It represents a small part of the global population and a lessening part of global GDP. The BRICS countries now are more powerful and larger than the G7. As a country or a bloc or a group of countries goes into decline, one tends to see, I think, more ideology, more sort of righteousness, and that's not healthy. I think the way to engage with China is to leave out the ideology, leave out any idea of democracies being superior, leave out the idea of Christianity being superior, leave out the idea of Western civilization being superior, just to deal with China on equal terms, to respect them and to engage in mutual respect. So it comes back to pragmatism, I think. But we are changing, Jeff. I think we are changing at certain levels. It's much healthier than it was in 2020. I think our foreign minister makes a big difference, and she influences the senior members of the cabinet. The other day, I noticed that Fortescue Metals took out a multi-billion-dollar loan in Chinese renminbi. And of course, they've cancelled a big clean energy project in the United States. So And of course, we've seen China, India, and Brazil all stand up to the Trump tariffs. There's a major conference later this week, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That organization and BRICS are becoming more and more central, more and more powerful. Of course, all of this makes some people concerned, especially American military. And I do hear from time to time the most ludicrous statements by American naval commanders. And they are there provoking China in the Taiwan Strait. In fact, when I was in Fujian last November, it was pointed out to me that there was a small island only 5 or 6 kilometres off the coast where there's some American military force, commandos. Imagine if there was a Chinese force or a Russian force off the coast of San Diego. And people say to me, but what about the deadline for China's invasion of Taiwan in 2027? Well, China, 2027 comes from the Americans. It doesn't come from China. And I don't think China is in the least interested in having to fight a war over Taiwan. It's the last of its alternatives. As Xi Jinping has often said, the Taiwanese and the Fujianese have been trading with each other and dealing with each other for years. The people in Fujian told me that they love going to Taiwan and Taiwanese come to them. There's an exchange of people between Fujian and Taiwan all the time, hundreds of thousands of people. It goes up and down with political changes. The two major political parties in Taiwan don't represent the same view. The second major political party, not in power at the moment, the Kuomintang, are in favour of eventual reunification with China. It's not just, it's not a separate country. It's been part of the prefecture of Fujian since 1683. The only way I see any conflict over Taiwan, any military conflict, is if the Americans seriously provoke one, in which case the Chinese will put their foot down. The trouble is that the United States is losing its influence and its credibility is diminishing. The dollar has diminished in purchasing power by 40%, I think, since the year 2000. Foreign ownership of US Treasury bonds has dropped from 34% in 2014 to 21% now. I don't think the Americans in the global picture have the influence that they once had, I'm sure of it, or the moral credibility. So I'm hopeful that in Australia we won't allow the influence of Washington to completely dictate our future actions. I mean, they're very unhappy with us at the moment because we won't promise to use their submarines in their war, in their hypothetical war. But, I'd like to see more of that. Well, I'll just finish on this note. They obviously find it very hard to accept that they are a declining power. And that is a worry because if you can't accept that you're in decline, you tend to lash out. And that's possibly what we might see.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Michael. I will include links to in the video description below to where people can get your book, Silk Silver Opium, The Trade with China That Changed History, and also some of your other books. Thanks again for joining me today.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.